Hi there. One of the most common pieces of advice I see for IELTS students is this: you need to learn more words and expand your vocabulary. And the most common sort of worksheets or exercises I see for IELTS are sort of long lists of basic words in English with their better or more formal synonym next to them. They say don't use help, use assist. Don't use think, use reflect. Don't use holiday, use excursion. I'm sure you've seen them. Maybe you've learned them. Um, Let me please tell you, it is the worst possible advice to follow. It will not help you score better in your IELTS exam, and more importantly, it will not really improve your English. Let me explain with an example from my experience as an IELTS examiner. A student comes in for a speaking test. I ask them about a holiday they had recently. I can see the student thinking, holidays. I have memorized a long answer about that with lots of interesting words. And they begin, I went to an excursion last year in Asia for 4 weeks, etc., etc. Great. You've used the word excursion, but you've used it wrong. Excursion has a different meaning to holiday. It's normally for shorter trips or trips within a holiday, for example, to a museum or a countryside. And you've used the wrong preposition before it. And you pronounced the word incorrectly. The examiner is not impressed. The logic students follow is completely understandable. Your IELTS score depends on a wide vocabulary. A wide vocabulary means lots of different words. So, learn lots of different words, especially sort of impressive sounding ones. In this video, I want to explain why this strategy doesn't work and what actually does. Let's start by analysing what we mean by a wide vocabulary. Yes, IELTS does reward a wide vocabulary, but wide in the sort of IELTS criteria means sort of flexible and varied use, not necessarily sort of unusual or complex words. The examiner isn't sitting there with a checklist of impressive words waiting to sort of tick them off. They're listening for evidence that you can use language naturally, accurately, and appropriately. And what does appropriately mean? It means using language that fits the situation. More formal academic vocabulary might be appropriate in a Task 2 essay. But in a speaking test, even at higher bands, the language should sound like a fluent, educated native speaker talking, not like someone reading from a dictionary. In real life, native speakers don't use all these complex words, not even in interviews. When a student sort of forces an unusual word into a sentence and it isn't appropriate, the meaning isn't exactly right, it's too formal, the verb that comes before it or the preposition that comes after it is wrong, it kind of has the opposite effect. It shows you're not flexible and comfortable with this language, and you may just have memorized and repeated the answer. You need to ask yourself a different question. Do not ask sort of how many words do I know? Ask how well do I know the words I already have? Think about the most common words in English, the 2,000 or 3,000 words that most people use in everyday speech and writing. You can find them online. Look up Oxford 3000 or any other similar list. If you look down that list, you almost certainly know most of them already. You've seen them, heard them, probably used them. But sort of knowing a word and really knowing a word are very different things. Really knowing a word means knowing what it collocates with, which are the words it naturally sort of appears together with. It means knowing its sort of phrasal verb forms. It means knowing when it's appropriate to use it and when it isn't. It means knowing what preposition comes after it or before it. It means knowing what its different grammatical forms are, its verb, its adjective, noun, adverb. It means being able to use it under pressure, sort of in real conversation, without thinking about it, like the IELTS speaking exam. This detailed knowledge, applied to words you already know, is what produces the kind of vocabulary that honestly impresses an examiner. Because it sounds natural, because it sounds like somebody who actually sort of lives in the language rather than someone who has been memorizing vocabulary lists for 6 weeks and is now trying to use all the unusual words connected to holidays he or she knows. Let me give you 4 specific areas of deep word knowledge and a concrete example of each one. First one is collocations. Now, a collocation is a pair or group of words that naturally go together in English. Native speakers use them automatically. Students who've learned vocabulary from lists often don't know them, and that's very obvious when you hear them speak. A very sort of easy example would be a sentence like, I did a mistake in my exam. This is wrong. We don't say that. Instead, what we do say is, I made a mistake in my exam. So make collocates with mistake, but did does not collocate with mistake. Another example would be, she did a good impression on the interviewer. Again, we don't say that. In fact, we say, she made a good impression on the interviewer. So here, again, make collocates with impression, but not did. So, make and do are words every student knows, but do they know what words they go together with? Knowing which one collocates correctly with mistake or impression, that's deep knowledge. Collocation errors are extremely common in IELTS writing and speaking, and they immediately tell the examiner that the student's vocabulary is more passive than active. The good news is that collocations are learnable, but you learn them in context, not from a list. Okay, the second area is phrasal verbs. You probably know what these are, although students often avoid phrasal verbs because they think they seem informal. But in IELTS speaking, phrasal verbs are a sign of natural, fluent English, exactly what examiners are listening for. For example, the word give is in the vocabulary of almost every IELTS candidate. But look at how a fluent speaker actually uses it together with prepositions to make phrasal verbs. For example, give up, which means to stop doing something. I gave up trying to memorize word lists. Give in, which means to surrender. Eventually, I gave in and asked for help. Give away, to reveal something or donate. He gave away the answer. Give out, to distribute or to stop working. My phone gave out mid-exam. Give off, which means to emit or send out. The heater gives off a lot of heat. All from one word and a few prepositions that you already know. You can create all these different meanings and phrases and expressions that can make you sound very, very fluent. A student who uses give up naturally and accurately in a speaking response in the IELTS exam is demonstrating more sort of real lexical knowledge than a student who tries to use a word they memorized last Tuesday. Okay, the third area is register and appropriacy. Register is about choosing language that fits the situation. This is where the strategy of using impressive vocabulary doesn't always work in the speaking test. Even in formal or academic situations, we don't normally speak using very sort of formal written vocabulary. There's a difference between the language you'd write in an essay and the language you'd use in a job interview or a university seminar discussion. In a job interview or seminar, our language isn't sort of magically different. We may use specific language related to the topic of discussion, but the basic language is the same as when we speak with our friends. We use phrasal verbs and things like that. We just don't use slang or offensive words as much. Let's look at some examples. If we were writing, we might say something like, the government has commenced a review of the policy. If we were speaking, we might say, the government has started a review of the policy. Commence and start mean exactly the same thing, but commence in a sort of a speaking context sounds rehearsed and slightly strange. Start sounds fluent. The examiner isn't rewarding you for using commence. They might sort of note or think that your register feels unnatural. The same applies to using words like utilize instead of use, or endeavour instead of try, facilitate instead of help. In writing, these can be appropriate. In speaking, they almost always sound unnatural, especially if you don't know exactly how to use them, as their meaning might not be exactly the same as their synonym. Okay, area number 4 are sort of grammatical patterns. This fourth area is knowing sort of the grammatical pattern a word needs. This is different from collocations. It's about the structure that follows a word or comes before it. Let's take an example of suggest. Suggest is a word every student knows, but do you know its pattern? For example, it's wrong to say, I suggest you to try a different approach. The correct thing to say is, I suggest trying a different approach, or I suggest that you try a different approach. Suggest cannot be followed by a to infinitive. But students who have learnt the word without its pattern make this error constantly. Knowing a word's grammatical pattern or form is part of knowing the word properly. And these patterns are learned through reading and listening in context, not by memorizing definitions or lists of words. So how do you develop this kind of deep vocabulary knowledge? Here are 3 things you can do right now. First, when you learn a new word or review a word you already know, don't just record its definition. Record its collocations. Write down 2 or 3 words that naturally go with it. Then write a sentence using that collocation. That single habit will change the way your vocabulary develops. Second, pay attention to phrasal verbs when you read or listen to English. When you see one, make a note of it, write it down, group them together with other phrasal verbs which have the same verb. You build this up, build these sort of groups of phrasal verbs up, and this will really help develop your English vocabulary and ability to express yourself. Third, practice noticing register and appropriacy. When you read something in English, an article, a book, a news report, ask yourself, could I say this in conversation? If not, why not? How could I say that in spoken English? Is it different? That active noticing builds sensitivity and understanding of register that most students simply don't develop. If possible, ask someone with a good knowledge of English, like a teacher, or use AI if necessary. Ask them, is it natural to say this in English? But I think most importantly, just focus on the words that are most common in English. The top 2,000 or 3,000 words. These cover 80 to 90% of all written or spoken English. None of these strategies are difficult, but they require a different kind of attention than most vocabulary study asks for. You're not memorizing, you're noticing, sort of connecting and using. That's how fluent speakers actually learn vocabulary. And it's how good IELTS candidates build the kind of vocabulary that really impresses an examiner. So the next time you see a list of complex or abstract words to use in the IELTS exam, stop. Forget it. Pick a word you already know, look up its collocations, find its phrasal verb forms, find out more about its grammatical structure. Make sure you know its different forms like the adjective and adverb. Think about when and how a fluent speaker would actually use it. You already have more vocabulary than you think. The work is learning to use it properly. Okay, if you found this useful, there's a link in the description to my website where you can book a free consultation. We can look at your specific vocabulary gaps and build a study plan around them. And there's a link to my WhatsApp channel where I share daily advice and interactive exam materials. Okay, I'll be back soon with more honest videos helping you be successful in the IELTS exam. I hope you can join me.